COVID, AI, and automation have all exerted pressure on our ability to learn. I spoke with an international leader in education, Andreas Schleicher, about how to adapt education systems to the modern world and set up new generations for future success. Andreas Schleicher is the Director for Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as the OECD, based in Paris. He has worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders around the world to improve quality and equity in education. He also created the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, an exam that compares how different countries educate and prepare their students for the challenges of the ever-changing professional world.
In mathematics, you always need to understand the solution in the real-world context.
Schleicher says learning, and specifically literacy, have benefits far beyond the classroom.
I want to thank WV for actually bringing people together.
I met Schleicher in New York City at a conference put on by the nonprofit Forum for World Education.
Literacy is now about navigating ambiguity, managing and resolving conflicting perspectives, viewpoints, distinguishing fact from opinion. It's no longer about extracting knowledge, it's about constructing knowledge. But when you look at how we teach literacy, why do we find, that half of Americans have difficulties distinguishing fact from opinion? Because actually that's not how we teach literacy. We still teach people to believe what they read, rather than to question the established wisdom of our times. And that's true in reading, that's true in mathematics, and then we get surprised by those results.
Nearly 700,000 students take the PISA test. Its most recent report found that reading and science have been on a downward trajectory for the past decade. Between 2018 and 2022, performance in math across the countries tested fell by a record 15 points. COVID has only made things worse. During the pandemic, students on average were behind 3/4 of a year in math and half a year in reading.
So tell us about the test. How is it designed? What are you looking for? And what were some kind of, I know a lot of this doesn't come as a surprise because you've been studying this for a long time, but are there countries that you're just like, wow, I can't believe this happened?
Yeah, that test is basically the most rigorous and extensive way of assessing student learning outcomes. It's about 15-year-olds. We test almost 700,000 15-year-olds in 81 countries, so it's a pretty good picture across the world of this state of education. We look at key subjects like mathematics, like science, like reading, but also at areas like, creative thinking, complex problem solving, social emotional skills, things that are really, really important in the world in which we live today. So it's a platform that allows you to see how well education systems deliver on their promise. We look also at to what extent education works for everyone, the extent to which education systems deliver good outcomes for students from all social backgrounds. So that's basically the picture that we take every 3 years. And then, you do see surprises. 15 years ago, who would have thought, that a poor country like Vietnam would have similar outcomes in mathematics than the United States? And that's a pretty recent phenomenon. Or Estonia, a post-Soviet country, actually a quite poor country in the European context, moving forward, also becoming one of the most digitized education systems. And so I think there are some really interesting stories. Who would have thought, that the 10% most disadvantaged students in Macau perform as well as the 10% wealthiest in the United States, so that, you can actually ensure that children from all social backgrounds get an excellent education. So I think there are some really interesting stories to tell that, mathematics is not a matter of talent. It's actually something that we can build a strong foundation for every child.
If there's anybody who really can give us a true assessment of the global landscape when it comes to education, it would be you. What do you see when you look at the global landscape?
Well, the global trend has not been that good. I think the COVID pandemic has accelerated many of the issues and problems. So we see students doing less well in a field like mathematics than we did, 4 years ago. But there are always good surprises as well. There are some education systems that back that overall trend and keep moving forward. You look to Singapore moving from good to great, parts of China. You look to Estonia in Europe for producing amazing results. So I think despite an overall not so great outlook, we see some education systems advancing, and we live in a time where we actually need a lot better education. Our economies, our societies become much more demanding now in terms of the knowledge of skills of people. So it really matters.
It does matter, and yet it doesn't seem like it's a primary consideration and emphasis in some countries where it should be, right?
Yeah, part of the issue is that it takes time for good, education to translate into better long-term outcomes. Now, you look at a country like the United States, it can still build its economy on a workforce that is well educated, because education in the past was a great model for everyone. So in a way, the US may not see the urgency. Why should I change education today when the economy is actually quite, successful and building on a great talent pool? But, our schools today is going to be our economy tomorrow. And that link is long, but it's very, very, very tight. And you can see countries like Korea that moved themselves, from poverty into a very, very successful economy based on education. You see a similar trajectory in China, but it's hard to get that message across because, it takes a long time for what we do in school today to be visible in our economies, our societies, our democracies, all of those outcomes now.
Can you talk a little bit more about the pandemic? What were some of the things that you saw as a result of the pandemic and how it may have impacted education?
The pandemic obviously has been a big disruptor of education, and you can see the effects. Now that's, I think, something that we have to live with and we have to catch up with. And often, individual tutoring is the only route to actually make up for all that gap. But, disruption sometimes creates also positive outcomes. During the pandemic, schools woke up to this digital world that is fundamentally transforming learning. Before the pandemic, we looked at AI as, conserving pedagogical practice. During the pandemic, it transformed learning practices. The students started to learn differently. They had to learn on their own. They had to learn at home. And I think those are really interesting things that I hope that we can take with us from this pandemic, that sometimes, learning is not a place. Learning is an activity, and that activity can be supported in different environments.
I think you mentioned that AI may not replace the teachers, but may actually make teachers better. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I personally believe that learning is always a social or relational experience. It's never just a transactional business. So AI is not going to be replacing teachers, I believe, but teachers who are good at using AI will replace teachers who are not using artificial intelligence. AI can super empower you as a teacher. It can make, learning more interactive, more personal. While you study mathematics on a computer, the computer can figure out, how you learn, how you study, and then make your learning experiences more personal. As a teacher, learning analytics can tell you how different students learn differently, and then, make your pedagogical approaches more fine-grained, more adapted. I think there are enormous potentials in AI-based technologies to super empower teachers. At the very same time, AI is not a magic power. It's just an amazing amplifier. It's an incredible accelerator. It will, amplify good mathematical teaching and also amplify poor mathematical teaching. We have AI-based tools that make learning more scripted, more, and that is a reality too. So I think it will require even better teachers to leverage the power of AI than we have today. If we, harness those forces, I think for the first time in history, we have a chance to provide every learner with an excellent education. Great teachers are hard to scale. There's a limited number of teachers. You cannot make them infinite. But with technology, you can, extend the reach of good teaching practices. You can share what good teaching practice is. You can connect, help teachers to collaborate. I think we have really, for the first time, that chance to make what we used to preserve for a small elite available to all. Now, what makes good education? Often it's about tutoring. It's this one-to-one experience, and technology can get you pretty close to this, away from the kind of one-size-fits-all education experience. You can see, Singapore moving from good to great. In the pandemic, they didn't move down, they moved further up.
Schleicher was a speaker at the conference, which focused on international perspectives on math education.
I have to be very honest with you. I hated math growing up. It was just not of interest to me. One of the things that really resonated with me when I was listening to you is 4 words. You said, "Don't make it boring." And I thought about that, and I thought, that's probably why I hated math. It just seemed like the teachers weren't interested in it. It was just kind of like memorization. Can you talk more about that?
Mathematics can be an incredibly interesting language to understand the structure of the world, but it needs to be taught in a way where students do not start out with a mathematical equation, but with a real world problem, and then learn how to use that language to apply it. As a teacher, I think you can make it one of the most intriguing subjects, and that's what our data show. In countries where mathematics is taught well, it is the favorite subject of most students, and it is a subject where you do not see, social background playing, and all children can learn. Mathematics is perhaps a subject where talent and genes matter less. If you study medicine, you need to have a really good memory. You need to have good facilities. If you study history, you need to learn a lot of facts. Mathematics actually is something that everybody can understand, everybody can learn. And I think if you enter the mathematics classroom with a belief that every child can learn mathematics, you deliver a very different education. Why do I say that? Because we see that in our data. We measure something that we call a student growth mindset in mathematics. Do you believe that, hard work and effort are going to be the key to success, or you do believe it's the intelligence with which you are born with? And that belief squares one-to-one with the mathematical results that we see in a country.
Some of the things you mentioned in your presentation today, I just want to kind of pull out a couple of the threads and maybe have you talk about it. Poverty is not destiny. Where I think here in the United States, people think, well, if you live in a rich, affluent area, you're going to get a great education. If you live in a poor area, you're not. And yet, as you pointed out, in Vietnam, where perhaps people are not wealthy, they're scoring well. So when you say poverty is not destiny, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, the data show very clearly that poverty need not be destiny. Often it is. You take the United States, if you come from a disadvantaged community, they probably send you to a school which has poorer kind of equipment, less qualified teachers, and so on. So actually, often school systems reinforce social disparities. That's an unfortunate reality, but it doesn't need to be like this. You look to many countries in Asia show us that we can actually attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, to give every child an excellent foundation. And that really matters. If you come from a wealthy background, you'll always have open doors in life. Even if you don't succeed so well in school, you'll find other ways around it. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you just have often just one single chance in your life, and that is, find a great teacher, be in a good school. And that's exactly what we see in many education systems today. They're very, very good in aligning resources with needs. They attract, talent into difficult circumstances. They have no tolerance for failure. If you come from a disadvantaged background, they don't lower expectations. They redouble their support for you. And that's, for me, one of the most powerful lessons, that actually students from very disadvantaged communities can get the very same outcomes that we see among the wealthiest in other countries.
Let's talk about class size and spending, because people focus on both of those. Are they important?
Well, money always matters. If you spend very little, you're not going to get good results. But very quickly, that relationship between investment and outcomes levels off. The United States is a country that is way beyond that point of return. So you can see the United States spends about twice per student than what other countries spend with similar kind of outcomes. So money is necessary, but it's not a guarantee for success. What matters often a lot more is how you invest your resources. If you have to make a choice between, a smaller class and a better teacher, go for the better teacher. That's what we can learn from high-performing education systems. If you have a teacher where you feel, my teacher knows who I am, my teacher understands and supports me in who I want to become, you work in a very, very different way than when you think you're just a number in a classroom.
You hear this expression in the United States, American exceptionalism, but when you look at where the U.S. lands in the scale, it's like right in the middle, isn't it? I mean, it's not necessarily that exceptional. There's things that you can learn from other countries and how they're doing things, but I'm going to be talking to Charlie in a little bit, where teachers from the UK went to Shanghai and vice versa, and they learned. And should there be more of that in the United States?
Yeah, first of all, I don't even think we can say the United States is in the middle. If you look in a field like mathematics, it comes out, 27th among 38 OECD countries. So that is not a good position, and it puts a lot of resources into education. So I think the position should be a lot better. You can never copy and paste an education system. So it's not about, looking at country X and say, we're going to be like this. But you can ask yourself, what is the driver of success of countries? Now, why are some countries so successful in mathematics? And ask yourself, what can we learn from what those countries do differently? And I think there's a lot we can do. In other fields, we are better than that. And, my background is science. As a scientist, it doesn't matter whether you work in the United States or Japan, you talk to each other, you share language, you learn from each other. If you invent something in the United States tomorrow, everybody in the world is going to look at this. In medicine, we do the same thing. Medical innovations spread rapidly. In education, it's almost an ideology that we're different from everybody else. And, teaching mathematics is a science. It is not about, the cultural context. You may have to adapt it. You may have to reflect the context, but I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, with each other, on how to give more people better education in this field.
And the landscape in the world is changing. I mean, there's so much talk about AI and machine learning and 5G. I mean, it goes on and on and on, which I think illustrates that math is going to become even more important. Can you talk to us about how, in many respects, the U.S. really isn't training the students that need to enter the workforce in the future if they're not focusing on this?
Yeah, it may not just be about more math, but about a different type of mathematics. In the past, it was about, learning mathematical content. Today, you can look it up. In a way, the dilemma for education is that the kind of things that are easiest to teach, easiest to test, are precisely the kind of things that are easiest to digitize and automate. In a time of ChatGPT, this world no longer rewards you for learning answers. It rewards you for asking the right questions. It rewards inquiry, curiosity, and this is precisely what good mathematics is about. Mathematics is not about, prefabricated routines and how I apply them. Mathematics is about, to teach you to think critically, to teach you to deploy curiosity, to solve problems that we can't even imagine with new tools. And if we don't get those skills, we will make children second-class robots, not first-class humans.
A newer aspect of education is how to teach students to recognize misinformation and fake news. A Stanford University study found that 80% of students mistakenly thought a post labeled paid advertisement was actually a news story. You wrote this: PISA shows that Korea, Singapore, and parts of China are the only jurisdictions where more than half of the 15-year-olds are fit for the digital world, like figuring out fake news. And one of the things you talked about was, back in the day it was extracting, and now it's constructing knowledge, that there's all this stuff out there. Can you talk about that and the importance of that?
Yeah, if you think about literacy as a construct that has so fundamentally changed in the last 20 years, 20 years ago, we all read linear texts, books. Everything you read used to be quite carefully curated. What you found in the newspaper, somebody had thought it might have reflected an opinion, but it was usually well-researched opinion. As a student, you could trust what you find in the school book. You have a question, you can look it up, you can trust the answer to be true. That was a simple world. Today, you look up things on Google and you find 10,000 answers to your question, and nobody's going to tell you what's right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true.
It's interesting, and kind of piggybacking off that, you wrote, understanding the nature of disciplines is very important, but what we often do in school is teach the surface of those disciplines. We basically just teach superficial content. It's got to be deeper, doesn't it?
Yeah, what we teach in students is often, a mile wide, but just an inch deep. And it's very easy to teach in this way. And the reason why we teach in this way, because we often test in this way. The world no longer rewards you just for what you know. No? Google knows everything. This world rewards you for what you can do with what. That is the big differentiator now, and that is often shortchanged. The more we can integrate learning and assessment, the more we can give students more real-time feedback on the quality of their work, the more we will encourage teachers to teach fewer things at greater depths. If you look at the highest performing education systems, what they teach is actually really simple. It's about rigor, it's about focus, it's about coherence. Rigor is about cognitive demand. One of the biggest mistakes we make in education makes things too easy for students, makes things boring. We think, we shouldn't, make them suffer or put pressure. But actually, students like to be challenged. That just has to be interesting. So to have a high level of cognitive demand is incredibly important. Every high-performing system does that. No tolerance for failure, very, very kind of high expectations on every child. Second thing is, teaching fewer things at greater depth. Get away from, overloading students with very superficial content. Teach you think like a mathematician rather than just memorizing equations, Teach you think like an historian, rather than just memorizing names and places.
One final question, which is the importance of, we talk about the classroom, the kids enter the classroom and the teachers have got to be engaged. But what about that relationship between teachers and the parents and the student? How important is that dynamic?
I believe that for many years, maybe decades, we had that assumption that school can somehow compensate or make up for what doesn't come from parents. And we designed schools around it. We built, many services in schools that, traditionally were provided by parents. 20 years later, we must concede that not a single country has succeeded with this. Schools cannot make up for parents. If your parents do not believe that education is important, if your parents do not respect teachers, if your parents, let you play with your mobile phone up to midnight, you're not going to be successful in education, whatever happens in school. Parents are incredibly influential. It is not the resources that parents have, or even the time they spend on the homework with their children. We found in our PISA assessment the simple question to parents: how was asking their children every day, how was school? Doesn't take a degree, doesn't take a lot of time, but it signals to your child, what you do in school matters to me. That had more of an influence on academic outcomes than parental income.
Andreas, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you.